Welcome to Evolutionary.org Hardcore 2.0 coming your way. This is episode 117. Today we're going to talk about top 10 Mr. Olympia steroid use by Euro Pharma. So in this episode, Mobster and I, we're going to talk about Mr. Olympia facts. There's a lot of people out there don't even know what Mr. Olympia is. They don't even know any Mr. Olympia like champions except Arnold. So we're going to kind of go over the history of Mr. Olympia, what got it started, and how it's been since. We're going to talk about why top pros use performance enhancing drugs. We're going to talk about pro cycles and steroids. We're going to talk about how you can apply those steroids to fit what you're trying to do. And we're
Yes.
going to talk about why Euro Pharma is one of the best. But first, let's go over a little bit about Mr. Olympia. So, the history of Mr. Olympia started in 1965, and I'm going to bring in Mobster on this one to kind of go over it. But Larry Scott was the winner. He was an American the first 2 years, 65 and 66. And then 67, 68, 69, Sergio Oliva was the winner, and he was from Cuba. And those first five Mr. Olympias, and also the sixth one in 1970, where Arnold was the winner, those were in New York. And the award at the time was $1,000. That was the prize
Yeah, yeah,
for
yeah,
Mr.
yeah,
Olympia at that time. So
yeah,
Mr.
yeah.
Olympia has mostly been held in the United States, but it's also been held in other countries:
Yeah.
Paris, France, West Germany, South Africa, Australia 1 year,
Yep.
London
Yep.
back in 82, Munich, Germany in 83 when Samir Bannout won it, Brussels, Belgium back in 85, Sweden in 87, Rimini, Italy in 89, Helsinki, Finland in 92. Otherwise, it's been held in the United States. Now, over the past handful of years, going back to 99, it's been mostly held in Las Vegas. With 2 of the years, it was held in Orlando, Florida. And then before that, cities like Los Angeles, Chicago, and even Atlanta
Yep.
were hosting it. So it's a really big event. So we started the first Mr. Olympia is $1,000. Now the recent champion in 2024, and we're doing this episode right after it. He walked away with a record 600,000. So previously
Nice.
it
Very
had been
nice.
400,000 from
Yep.
2015 to 2023. Now it's up to 600,000. So it's a big prize to win Mr. Olympia. But more importantly, when you win Mr. Olympia, you get worldwide recognition, and you basically corner the market when it comes to endorsements. So 600,000 is chump change. Samson is going to open himself up to millions in potential endorsements, endorsing
Yes.
supplements,
Yes.
endorsing fitness equipment, endorsing gyms, just showing up to a gym. Oh my God, you can post a sign: Samson Dada worked out here, or Derek Lunsford worked out here, or Hadi
Yep.
Chupon, or
Yep.
Big Robin, Hadi Chupon, and Brandon Curry and Sean Roden, Phil Heath, all the recent Mr. Olympia champions. Post that in your gym. Hey, these guys train here. They came here. They visited here.
$10,000, Stephen. That
Have
was
a
a few
big
years ago.
picture.
More than that now.
Yeah, so go ahead, Mobster. Talk about Mr. Olympia, how it started and how it grew in popularity. I think a lot of reason it grew in popularity was Arnold, who really caused it to
I think
grow.
Arnold and Joe Weider, Steve, because there's this. I've got loads of stuff on the history, and this could be a 3 4 hour podcast if we went into every detail. But essentially, the name ironically came, and Arnold, sorry, whoever the hell else was sitting around the table at the time, Joe Weider was very ambitious. And obviously, arguably at one point, the biggest supplement company to bodybuilders, the most magazine sales, etc., etc. When he sold his magazines, just as magazines were about to drop off, he sold them to another company, a very big media company, for something in excess of $300 million. The supplement company and the weights, which included company names that we were not familiar with, so under other names, as well as the obvious Weider brand and supplements and health products that were not directed specifically at bodybuilders, so more for the general market, was worth probably something in excess of $1 billion. And a lot of people know that. So they don't even realize that it wasn't just the Weider brand. There was a bunch of other brands and a bunch of other magazines, as well as Flex and Muscle and Fitness, that Joe Weider owned. Now, way back in time, as Steve said, 63, 64, 65, whatever it was, he basically was up against organizations like the AAU, up against organizations like NABA, and very cleverly decided to do two things with his brother Ben Weeder at the time. One was create, and there's a lot of argument about that history, so I'm not going to get into that. Create the IFBB. He was arguing against the amateur slash pro thing that the AAU, which of course included in the name of the AAU is the word amateur. And he wanted bodybuilders to earn some money. Now, $1,000 back in '65. It's not a huge amount of money, but you're probably looking at guys that are on 60, 70, $80 a week. So now suddenly I'm going to give you 2 months' salary. Joe was clever because he's making a shitload more than that. And the Olympian name come, according to one story, from the fact they were sitting around a table brainstorming and they had tins of Olympia or Olympic beer on the table, and they were trying to come up with a better name than Mr. Universe. Names like Mr. Galaxy, which had been used, and other things were bandied about. But for whatever reason, and maybe it was an Olympic year, Steve, the Olympia name came into being. And of course, you've got the whole Mount Olympus, Hercules, Zeus, etc., pseudonyms and the Greek mythology that can come as part of that as well. So that's where that came from. Obviously, with any kind of name, it's the brand and what it represents. So here's the thing, and someone's actually talked about this just in the last couple of days on another podcast. And the gist of that conversation was thus: you could offer more money for winning, for example, the Arnold Classic, and they may well do. But the kudos of winning the Mr. Olympia is a little bit like winning the World Cup. Footballers that play in the World Cup do not earn hundreds of thousands of dollars. There are certain matches in sports where you will earn more money doing shows, more money putting on a charity event, etc. But the kudos, the name and what it means to people, and specifically what it means to bodybuilders, has always been, or certainly been for a long time, probably 1970 onwards, grew to the point where it didn't really matter about the money. The very idea of the title was a thing in and of itself. So, as I say, and although Steve's quite correct, the $600,000 prize that Samson won a couple of weeks ago is the biggest prize anybody's ever won in bodybuilding, as an actual trophy, not as a contract, not being paid, but literally just winning as with the medal, with the Sandow statuette. It's the biggest amount of money that's ever been offered. But it's the kudos, it's what comes with it. And arguably, and me and you talked about this on a recent show that we discussed, the idea of the genetics of top professional bodybuilders. We also said you need to be a businessman. You need to understand the impact of social media. So like Steve says quite correctly, the idea that Samson Duado will travel the world and make a great deal of money. He's currently, literally this week, Steve, 1 week after the Olympia, he started on and I think it ends this week, so nearly 2 weeks as we do this show, a tour of China. And the American-style gyms that the Chinese have are growing. The supplements that they can sell to 1.5 billion, 1.6, 1.8 billion Chinese people, and it's even just a fraction of that market that have the disposable income is immense. And it was back in the day, 10, 15, 20 years ago, that top pros, when bodybuilding had sort of a mini peak at the time, you could earn $10,000 for an appearance, for going opening a supplement shop, for being involved with a supplement tour, or specifically a big gathering, 500, 600, 800, 1,000 people to a gym opening or something like that, and easily pick up $10,000 at certain of those events. They just want, just guest posing, say in Russia, $10,000 for doing those kind of things. So it's like anything else, Steve. I don't care what sport you're involved in. If you market yourself well, the idea of having a Mr. Olympia come to your gym, as Steve said, the way you carry yourself, how you are on social media, there is an opportunity, arguably, to make an enormous amount of money. We will say, because it's important to point this out, that a low-level golf pro will make more just in contracts, Steve, never mind winnings and prizes, etc. Tennis pro, the same. A mediocre but professional American football player will probably earn, without endorsements, just as a contract, as much as, if not more.
The new collective bargaining agreement for the NFL, which is going to kick in soon, the minimum salary, if you just make the team, not even if you play, just making the team, making the roster, is $1 million a year. So that obviously, I mean, that's a lot of money.
Yeah.
1 million a year. So let me let's do some listener questions while I'm starting on Mr. Olympia. And the first one
Yes.
I want to ask you is, how do you qualify for Mr. Olympia? I think a lot of people want to know that one.
Right. So there are organisations, the NPC, and there are amateur organisations, professional organisations. So we'll stick with the pros. So there are certain the NPC will allow, talk to promoters, work out how big the event's going to be, etc., etc. And throughout the year, you have certain pro qualifying, meaning the person goes from an amateur to a pro by winning certain competitions. And then the next level up, which will be the top competitions, there's probably, I think, Steve, I'm going to say worldwide, maybe 20, maybe a little bit less. In America, there's probably 6, 7, 8. It depends year on year how busy the promoters are, whether they think they're going to make money from an event, etc. And again, NBC allowing them to do so. There's probably about 6, maybe 7, something like that, competitions which are specifically in America, as well as obviously additional ones around the world, uh, Olympia qualifier competitions. So think of it in the same ways again as a tennis or a golf thing. There's your local competition at the club, then there are regional competitions, national competitions, international competitions. And the higher rank the competition is, the more likely that competition will be able to qualify with the pro organization in allowing that event to say the top 2, the top 3, maybe just the first place winner, etc., is allowed to compete. You've also got automatic qualification. If you made the top 3, you typically number 2 and number 3 will qualify for the following year's Mr. Olympia. And if you've ever won the Mr. Olympia, you are qualified for life. You never have to qualify again. So there's ways and means. Like I said, it's the same as any sport, whether it's gymnastics or whatever else. You don't win a local competition and go to the Olympics. You would have to go to regional and national events, etc., etc. There are ways in certain sports where committees can sit down, and this has happened at Mr. Olympia, where they've invited someone that's outstanding, but for whatever reason hasn't had the opportunity to qualify through one of his qualifying competitions. And that's happened a few times. I don't believe it happened this year, but it certainly happened in previous years. And ironically, sometimes that person has done incredibly well. We've also seen, for example, Derek Lunsford is a good example of this, where he's won the 212 class, and that allowed him, as a Mr. Olympia 212 winner, to move up to the pro class and qualify that way, because he qualified in previous competitions, but also because he'd won a different class. So that happens as well. There has been elements in the past. It's probably less likely to happen now because we're more vocal. We can deal with it quicker. Social media gets the news out there quicker, and so on and so forth. But there's certainly been, why the fuck's this person on stage? How the hell did they qualify? And so on and so forth. Shenanigans in the past. And that was probably as a result of business interest, which includes the judges, the promoter of the organization, supplement companies, and so on and so forth. For example, supplement companies sponsor an event, offering to pay $100,000 towards the prize. Lo and behold, the athlete that works for their organization suddenly becomes invited to a competition. So there's loads of things like that.
So
but again, you can argue that with any sport against Steve.
Another question is, what determines the winner of Mr. Olympia? Has that ever changed over time, or is it one of those situations where it's just judging and points?
I will argue that it was changed. It has changed because you could go back in time and look at the aesthetics and the shape and the outline of previous Mr. Olympia winners, going back decades, in fact, versus how certain physiques look now. So former pros have argued this a lot of times, and will quite often argue, and this happens again with other sports, that their era was better. And that's one of those kind of weird things in terms, but arguably, I would argue it thus. You and I did this example on another show. We talked about someone that doesn't follow the sport at all being invited to a local competition, and 9 times out of 10, if they're asked, they can pick the winner, or they certainly can pick the top 3 in a class, because they have an innate understanding of what a bodybuilder should look like in their minds. Now, that might be from media influence, it might be from art, it might be from mythology and whatever else. So the quote that used to be given that someone looks like a Greek god applies. So for I've spoke to judges. I've never been a judge of a bodybuilding competition, but a buddy of mine, Keith Williams, has. And Keith was quite vocal in the looking at the aesthetics or lack thereof, certain physiques approaching this year's Mr. Olympia. With one, for example, dropping out. Nick Walker was heavily pushed as a freak. And freaks are visual impact type athletes. But Keith pointed out the obvious, said he's got too blocky of a waist. He has lax aesthetics. He does have an impact. It's the freak factor. Seeing him standing there, seeing him walking down the street, you would literally go, your eyes would be drawn to him, Steve, in the same way as you would if Godzilla appeared over the horizon. But Godzilla's not a good-looking lizard, and Nick's not a great-looking bodybuilder. He lacks that aesthetics. And the aesthetics would be broad-shouldered, slim waist, great skin, good separation between the muscle groups, carries himself like a champion, and so on. So here's the thing. It's kind of sometimes like a beauty queen, sometimes it's innate. So I've done this before, and I'm sure even yourself, who doesn't really follow the sport of bodybuilding as such, but you're obviously fully aware of it, would be able to talk about if you and I went to the Mr. Olympia and someone come out, slim-waisted, broad-shouldered, full six-pack, separation with the muscles, vascular, ripped, dry, even if you and I didn't necessarily like their physique per se, it didn't suit the thing that we had in our mind, we'd still say he's going to win because look at everybody else on stage. That one lacks condition, that one's waist is too wide, his forearms are weird, I don't know why he's got no calves, etc., etc. 9 times out of 10, we would still know who's going to win just based on certain small things that we see. And I've said this before, if someone comes out who's 6 foot tall and the rest of the lineup is 5'10" or under, and everything else was equal, the visual impact, even in the judge's mind, is such that you cannot help but have your eyes drawn to the taller athlete. So there are certain innate things. I'll give you an example. Listeners will understand this. I weigh, as this morning, Steve, 327 pounds. And if you didn't know me and you saw me coming down an alleyway towards you in shadow, and you couldn't see it was Mobster smiling with his teeth, etc., etc., because I've recognised you, just saw this great lump walking towards you, your innate response is to be careful in case I kick off and want to kill you or hit you or attack you in some way. So it's a certain innate visual response to certain particular people. So, for example, like I said, combination, you need to look healthy even if you're not. You need to have great skin, good tan. You need to have done the oil, etc., correctly. We've seen some fantastic pros that fuck their oil up or fuck their tan up. You need to come on stage like you own the fucking building that the stage is in. You need to act and feel and give the sense of being a winner. And then you need to combine that because everybody on the Olympia stage with you's got a good physique. They've won regionals, they've won nationals, they've qualified before. They are the top 10, top 20 bodybuilders in the fucking world, and they're sharing a stage with you. But you need to stand out from that group. You can have few to no flaws in your physique. If you do have flaws, you're incredibly good at hiding them. You need to be arguably a good poser. And sometimes being 300 pounds does not mean you're a great poser, and so on and so forth. So, for example, even a silly thing this year with Samson was he'd spoken very briefly. He's not big on speeches pre-competition, but he'd done 1 or 2 things to camera for social media or whatever else, talking about how he felt about chance of winning. And then during both his speeches and since when he's been interviewed, his emotions, the passion, the drive, the having to go without food, the certain things that he's lost in order to be a champion have come across in some of these conversations that other pro bodybuilders have hidden or not talked about. And that's actually attracted more people to him as a top professional. And then immediately he's gone on a tour. Lots of pros in the last couple of years haven't done that. They've won the money. They've gone off. They've gone and had some time with their misses, the kids, etc., etc. Samson's immediately taken advantage. He's working with a company that's got incredibly excited and so on. So, yeah.
So let's ask one more question before we move on to the next one. How does a person actually become a judge at Mr. Olympia?
Now, it used to be, historically, Steve, it could be anything. But the last, I'm going to say 20 years plus, probably 30 years, Steve, I'll have to think about it. It might even be closer to 40. I've actually qualified via NABA as a training instructor. And some of the bigger organizations, including the NPC, the IFBB, etc., now have proper, you have to pay, you go, you sit down, you attend actual courses that you never used to have. You could, in the past, you could have been a former promoter of another competition, high level. You could be someone that coached people to a high level. You could be a top professional bodybuilder in the past, so you should have a good eye. But again, that used to be the case. Now you have to literally do an exam. You have to. They will. You're invited typically after done a short training course, and it's not cheap. It costs a bit of money. And then you get invited as a guest judge, so your score is not included, but you will sit on the judging panel at a medium level, in national level, and high level competition, and they teachers, if you like, will then look at your scores, see how good your scores were or how much they matched already existing judges, and compare those in that particular way to see if you have quote unquote the eye, to see if you know what you're supposed to be looking for as a judge, and so on and so forth. And then obviously at that point, if you're good, and this happens a couple of times, you're able to qualify as a judge. As I say, in the past, that wasn't the case. And you had some dubious decisions, to say the least, and people that shouldn't have been sitting there, and local mayors and stuff that were not, they're invited along as an honorary sort of judge, a load of cobblers basically. But now, for the last few years, even smaller organisations, you and I couldn't think to name, Italian and Spanish organisations, there are standards. The same that we've talked about on another show, there used to be 20 or 30 organisations that could prepare you to be a trainer of bodybuilders, and the standards were all over the place. The same thing applied to being a judge. It was all over the place. But now most organisations, most countries' organisations, including those we've never heard of, have actual standards and tests, and you have to go along to a competition and judge without your score being included. And then the teachers, whoever it is, the head of the organisation, will look at your numbers, look how you judge the competition, see whether your scores have been thrown out or kept, etc., etc. And they then know that you are actually going to do the job properly, and you become qualified. Again, it can be a thankless job, Steve. Some of your decisions are going to be, people, bodybuilders won't like your decision. Sometimes you get expenses, sometimes you don't, which means it could be, even if you get to go and visit the event for free, you have had to pay for your own hotel, your own traveling costs, and so on. So it's not nothing you're not going to make money from. On the other hand, you can be, if you end up qualifying, someone that could be judging in MrOlympia at some point, and your expenses will probably be covered there. Vegas is a great place to be invited to judge a competition at, and you'll be well looked after, etc., etc. And there's a certain honor that you was the judge, or one of the 12 judges, etc., that was chosen to judge a MrOlympia, and it means something. In the same way as winning the MrOlympia competition means something to the bodybuilder, being allowed to judge a MrOlympia competition would mean a great deal to the judges themselves. So as often as not, as I say, could be former pros, could be big name promoters, etc. They still have to qualify. They still have to do a good job. And now I think even the top level, even the pro bodybuilder, pro judges, etc., at the MrOlympia level, are still looked at by the organisations in a way that they never were before. So they still need to do a good job on a regular basis. Mistakes are occasionally made, and that person might not be invited back again. So for the most part, it is a lot more stricter, and it's a bigger deal, and you have to qualify in a way that you never did before.
So let's discuss one more thing before we move on, Mobster. Let's talk about, because we talked about on the pre-show, what can make MrOlympia more popular, like the Super Bowl. And I'll talk about my
Yeah,
American opinion. You give your British opinion, but I think in America, look, we don't like sports or competitions that are based on judges, where there's too much gray area and that's more individualized. The same way boxing has kind of died out, because in boxing, you go up there, they fight, and then the judges mark points. And at the end of the day, the guy, literally, one dude dominated the other guy, but he ends up losing because
yeah,
the other guy, even though he got dominated, the judges determined he had gotten more shots on him. So it's kind of weird, but in sports, yes, there's referees, they can definitely affect the game, but whether it's basketball, football, hockey,
Yeah,
Baseball.
the most points wins. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah,
and
yeah.
but more importantly too, it's a team sport, and I think Americans, the way we've been kind of raised on, the military works as a team
Mm,
to accomplish a
yes.
goal. It's not about the individual; it's about the team. So I think Americans like the strategy behind team sports, and they like the way it's not a gray area where it's just judges watching. Like imagine if we watched a football game. I'm talking about American football, and two teams played, and you had three judges sitting there, and they were the ones after the game who determined who won based on what they saw. I mean, that would be ludicrous because that's not how we judge who won the football game. We judge, like you said, on based on who has the most points when the time expires. It's not who has the most points in the first quarter or second quarter or third quarter. It's who has the most points at the end of the game. And I think that's what people like. So it gets very frustrating too. Like even with the Olympics, a lot of Americans don't like the Olympics because a lot of Olympic sports are also based on judges, and they get points. And it's,
Gymnastics is the
yeah,
obvious one, Steve, where
yeah,
we can't. We just saw something that you and I would go, "That's perfection," and they'll get 9.9. They go, "Perfection's 10. I've just seen perfection. Why didn't they
yeah.
get 10?"
Or they'll do something that the viewer isn't seeing, but the judges are
Yes.
noticing and they'll get like
Swimming.
8.8.
Swimming was one where
Yeah.
you wasn't allowed to celebrate the fact that you won. And that recently they had a person that was 2 or 3 body lengths ahead of the second athlete, and he had to redo something, or there was a big hoo-ha over it because he punched his fist in the air and was celebrating the win. I think it was actually encouraged by someone else, and they said, "Oh, you can't do that," and they almost threw him out of the competition. You're like, he fucking won. How can he not win? How did he not win? Because he's 3 lengths ahead and he got to the end thing and touched the board in the swimming pool. How's he? Why is he? He didn't cheat. He didn't push anybody underwater. He didn't put a propeller blade on his back. He won, and you're telling me he didn't win because he celebrated his win when he shouldn't have done. It's stupid stuff. So yeah, look, the obvious thing here, Steve, is twofold, and I'll use soccer in this country as an example. Okay, and also talk about the recognition and the drug as well, of course. So number one, nearly every person that watches American football or watches soccer on the television has at some point played American football or played soccer. So there's a dream of the man in the street, say, and again, I'll use the soccer analogy, that he could kick a ball like that he could run down a pitch like that. So the conceptual thing is, if I'd have been lucky and or put the time and effort in, then that maybe I could have been a good soccer player, or maybe because I was good at high school, I was good right up to the college level, I could have been a great football player, American football player. So there's a little bit of that. Now, whether that's hockey, whether that's baseball, basketball, or American football, the 4 big sports, golf, tennis, etc. You and I, even me, I played Canadian rules football at school because we had a Canadian sports teacher. And that was literally my last year when I can become vaguely athletic. And literally during puberty, Steve, my testicles dropped. I grew, I got taller. I was now part of that little group that was more sporty versus the rest of the group. I hadn't been prior to that. So even I got to play that. I was all played in goal, football. I've had a few games of tennis, badminton, squash, and so on and so forth. So I've tried those sports. So when you see those sports, there's the idea that maybe you could have done those. I've even played darts as part of a team in my early 20s, snooker and pool, and so on and so forth. So all of those sports, um, the common man thinks that perhaps he could have had a chance, and therefore it's more attractive. And again, I can go out and buy some football kit, buy a football, and kick a ball around a pitch. Real easy. And even though arguably the actual clothing is a bit expensive, in reality, I spent thousands of pounds here, probably something like $6,000 or $7,000 on the gym equipment that I've got here. I would only have to spend about $500 or $600 to buy all the kit to play football, even if I'm just kicking the ball myself into the back of a net on some pitch somewhere. So I could, and golf would be the same. I could go out and spend a couple of $1,000s on a golf set. I don't need to spend tens of thousands of dollars, etc., to have a go at those sports. So that's number one. Number two, of course, is the way that they're promoted, the way that they're advertised, the support by businesses, etc., etc. The obvious thing when it comes to bodybuilding, and you and I talked about this in the pre-show, is the lack of recognition by Joe Public. And I said to you as an example, they've been top professional Mr. Olympia level, including, I believe, even Mr. Olympia winners that have been in airports with, they're not standing there in their posing briefs, obviously, but you and I would recognize, Jesus Christ, Steve, look at the fucking arms on that monster. And we wouldn't think he was a bloody wrestler. We wouldn't think he played American football. We would know, because we follow the sport a little, me more than you, that it was a professional bodybuilder. Or certainly we would know if we recognize him if it was in Mr. Olympia. But Joe Public will say, are you a wrestler? Do you play hockey? You look like some sort of athlete. And people are looking at you. Can I ask you who you are? They don't know who this person is. They would tell you instantly who won the Super Bowl. They would know who won Wimbledon. They would know who's just done a playoffs in basketball, but they have got no idea who this person is. And that comes down to the lack of promotion. Even promoters and organizers of competitions quite often don't know how to do press releases. So local newspapers might pick it up, maybe, if there's a big name coming, or if they thought about doing it. That doesn't happen. The news, very rare. I'm talking about big name, the main news at the end of 10 o'clock news in this country would never tell you that Dorian Yates had won Mr. Olympia. It just wouldn't occur to them to do so. They wouldn't see that the interest was there. And of course, there's the association with drugs. The irony, and me and you have done this on other shows, as we pointed out, if the average US adult is on 5 prescribed medications, the idea that bodybuilders are doing loads of drugs is almost kind of a joke. The price and cost of American medical healthcare that you and I talked about in the pre-show makes that kind of silly again. Drugs are promoted on adverts and billboards at the side of the highway, which we don't have here in this country, in the United Kingdom, but you do in America. So, the whole association with steroids, and it's kind of silly. I think something else you and I talked about in the pre-show, I said there are beauty competitions, and a quote on a documentary that I was watching just before this podcast was something along the lines of, no one cares what drugs you're taking, they only care how you look. Well, the same could be said of women winning beauty competitions and using diet drugs to get into shape, to get into the dresses and the bikinis, etc., to win the Miss Universe or the Miss World. No one's asking them girls, did you take drugs? And they don't get the association, but because it's beauty and not muscle, and the association is different, people see it different. So that perception, we have seen in the past, 20, 30 years ago, ESPN used to do regular bodybuilding training shows, would go to the Olympia, would go to the Arnold and so on and so forth. But for whatever reason,
no ratings. They used to do,
yeah.
They used to
I said
do.
to you in the United Kingdom, Steve, the biggest one, and I talked about this, and I said this to you in the pre-show. It is ironic in his way that the world's strongest man, Tom Stoltman, has won it 3 times. We've had several winners here from the United Kingdom. Would probably be more recognised, more well known, and 100% more likely to be on the TV when we only have half a dozen channels, versus, say, for example, Samson has just won the Mr. Olympia. I don't buy newspapers. I would have to look as pre-show's research. I suspect he might have been mentioned on a couple of the online websites for the newspapers. He'd be very, very lucky if he made the newspapers here, and he certainly wouldn't be front page news. Whereas, for example, the Super Bowl would be on every fucking news item for days.
123 million people watch the Super Bowl.
There you go.
Yeah. So they can advertise. It costs millions of dollars to advertise a 30-second
How
spot.
much is a halftime advert? You've got the halftime show, Steve. I'm told that the most expensive adverts on TV that you have in America are for the halftime show at the Super Bowl.
Absolutely, yeah. And one more thing I want to bring up before we move on to the next topic: sports gambling and fantasy sports. That's big.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And the Native
Can't really
American
do that with bodybuilding. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you can't do that because you've got judges. And could you imagine if people bet on who's going to win Mr. Olympia? They would strangle the judges, and the judges could bet on it themselves. So that's a big thing. You can't do fantasy sports with with Mr. Olympia. A lot of people don't, like, a lot of young guys, a lot of you guys, young guys listening to us, you don't even have a favorite team, but you still watch sports, NBA, NFL,
you
baseball.
couldn't do a video game on bodybuilding, Mr. Olympia.
Yeah,
You
that's
can
another
with
thing too.
football, you
Yeah.
can with soccer. Yeah.
Yeah. But my point is like with fantasy sports, like a lot of you younger guys, especially, you bet on these fantasy sports, you play fantasy sports teams, you don't even have a favorite team. So it's big, it's important to you, and you'll watch the games, that's your entertainment. You'll cheer for a team that you have, or you cheer for a player that you're watching. You can't do that in bodybuilding. You're not going to go there and cheer for Samson to win Mr. Olympia because he's on your fantasy bodybuilding team, you know?
Yeah.
So it's there's just so much to it where the bodybuilding it's very complex, and there's been a lot of failures along the way with the people who've promoted bodybuilding. They're not good at what they do to
Do you
promote
know what?
it,
See,
and
the
there's not,
closest,
but
I'll tell you something. Yeah,
and the
the closest we
bodybuilders
get to
themselves,
that.
the bodybuilders themselves aren't good at promoting themselves either. We don't
Yes,
have an
I was
Arnold
going to say, see, the
to promote
closest
it.
we get to that, ironically, would be when you have these wrestlers and to film stars or people that have been very popular. For example, in Star Wars, when they go to organizations like Comic Con, that's as close as we get, because if you go to Comic Con or similar, you'll have someone that was in Doctor Who, someone that was in Star Wars, someone that was Star Trek, and these people can make a great deal of money that weekend that the event is on, selling pictures of themselves and autographs, and top professional bodybuilders are like that. But you won't really see a Comic Con type event for golf or American football. You do for wrestlers, you do for the movies and music, and you do for bodybuilding. You don't really see it for much of anything else. And for example, at Comic Con, I could buy comics. I can't go to one of these promos for top bodybuilders at the Olympia, for example. We used to meet the pros or whatever else. No one's selling me old magazines, but if I went to Comic Con, at least I could buy some old comics. And there's people walking around dressed up as their favorite characters. So again, that's the closest we get to it, and that makes it feel a little bit nerdy as well. You see what I mean? So there's that element. Same thing with professional wrestling. In insofar as it's scripted, it's entertainment, etc., etc., and yet people will pay money to go and talk to a former professional wrestler and buy his autograph and have a picture taken with him and so on and so forth. Let's move on now, I think, Steve, to the number one thing, and we will get into this really in depth now. The whole drug slash steroid thing with regard to professional bodybuilding and specifically Mr. Olympia. So Steve and I are going to talk about really kind of like what steroids, if not the top 10, certainly the top 6 steroids used by professional bodybuilders. So look, number one, when it comes to use steroid use, peptide use, drug use, PED use, SARMs, etc., why do professional bodybuilders use these items? And the reality is, they're almost obliged to, Steve, because I think you used the phrase before on other shows when you said chemical warfare. I agree. If I am a national level physique and my opponents are national level physiques from all over the world, I would be leaving something on the table if they was all using PEDs and I did not. I would have to have a godlike physique to look like them without PEDs. So the idea that I could turn up to a show, Mr. Olympia specifically, and not use any steroids is kind of silly. I literally, it's like going to a drag race, Steve, in your car and put it up against what we call a funny car, an actual dragster. Dragster's got 5,000 fucking horsepower, these huge tires on the back, and special fuel. And you and I turn up on a Honda Civic that we've hoovered out, we've had it detailed, we made sure it's got high octane petrol in it, gas, but it's not got the stuff that they're putting in the dragster. It's not got those tires. It's not got 5,000 horsepower. We would be laughed at. That thing would be out of the end of the track and back up in the garage when you knew and I was still driving down the strip. So the idea that a top professional bodybuilder could not use steroids is almost kind of silly. So they have to. They have to because everybody else is. And therefore, the warfare is in how much they use and the results that they get to add something to their physique so that they kind of, as best they possibly can, guarantee that they're going to do well. If their diet and nutrition and everything and train and rehab and recovery is on point, they need to make sure that their PED use is done in such a way that it brings them into the best condition. And of course, that's best versus everybody else's condition. So there's a big argument to be made for them almost having to use steroids. Otherwise, they get laughed off stage. If you and I turned up, we hadn't dieted, we'd be laughed off stage. If we hadn't trained, we'd be laughed off stage. But let's assume all those things are good to go. The idea that we hadn't used tren or
We
halo or testosterone, come on.
Yeah, we've seen people actually pull out of Mr. Olympia who've actually qualified. And
Yeah,
I've always wondered why that is, but that might be one reason. It could be due to injury, but
yeah,
injury ties into that. If you get injured and you can't train, then obviously you're going to not look good. So it might as well not even show up. You're not going to, even get in. Not everybody who shows up to Mr. Olympia walks away with a prize. You have to place, to,
top 10, I think, Steve,
yeah,
out of 20.
yeah.
It used to be
So,
the bottom 10 got nothing for years.
yeah. So that's how it is. But look, at the end of the day, you know, anabolic steroids, they work. They break down barriers to push you to greater heights. They work many different ways. I mean, they boost protein synthesis. They help the foods that you eat partition better so that
Yeah.
every meal you eat, every single meal you eat becomes becomes more valuable in while you're
Yes,
on
you
anabolic steroids.
utilize better. You're more able to
Yes.
keep muscle when you're trying to strip away every ounce of under the skin body fat and water. You are arguably, and this has been said by top professional bodybuilders, you are, including Dorian Yates, you are visually something else, but in terms of your actual sense of health and well-being, perhaps not. So arguably, the ones that look the most ripped and the most conditioned probably feel the shittiest. But then that would be argued if someone running a marathon. No one runs a marathon to feel good. They might if they win $100,000, but for the most part, they're kind of fucked when they run across the line. That's kind of the point. To push yourself and be the best athlete, or in this
Yeah.
case, the best bodybuilder.
It
So
makes
yeah,
you
absolutely, Steve. Yeah.
makes you more androgenic and anabolic, more aggressive in
Yes.
the gym, more
Yes.
strong, lowers
Yes.
SHBG, which is going to cause your hormones to rise even further and allow that barrier where your body wants to keep muscle off. It's going to
Yes.
basically shut that off. So your body is going to be forced to hold on to more and more muscle in the process. The amount of muscle that is on the frame of anyone who's at Mr. Olympia, okay, is beyond anything the
Yes.
body is capable of holding. And if you took anyone from Mr. Olympia, if you took Samson after his Mr. Olympia win and he was on a plane flying home, whatever, and it crashed on an island, now he's stuck on an island for a month. And now he doesn't have access to his steroids, doesn't have access to the amount of food and protein that he's getting. He has
Yeah.
very little access to food, and no access to any of these drugs or hormones. What do you think is going to happen? He's going to shed muscle very, very quickly because that environment of his body is no longer there. So he'll shrink up a lot. Actually, the odd thing is it'd be actually a very healthy experience for him because it would actually boost his health by him shedding off all that muscle and giving his organs a break.
We've
So
seen top professional bodybuilders, Steve, that because of injuries, like you said, have had to. I'm thinking of Gary Stridham as a great example. There's a couple of others that spring to mind, but Gary, for example, had some terrible elbow or knee injury back in the day that required surgery. And I'd actually seen him at a seminar looking fucking epic, unbelievable, great condition, moaning like a bitch, apparently, not just at the gym I was at, but a bunch of others because he was dry, he was hungry, he was tired, he was busy, making loads of money, but it wasn't easy work. And then he had to lose a ton of muscle. We've seen this with a couple more recent years where they've had neck injuries or back injuries or whatever that are built up over time. Ronnie Coleman's a good example. Um, and Gary was featured in Muscle Mag International looking like a tennis pro. He had some muscle, but he looked like a muscular tennis player. He did not look like someone who had been on the Olympia stage or with the WBF as it was at one point. He did not look epic. So, yeah, that was probably about 6 months. It was like, who the fuck is this person? Oh, my God, it's Gary Stridham. How is that possible? Let's talk about now, Steve, and I've got examples in front of me, the kind of steroids and specifically the amounts, because we've done this on other shows as well. So I've got a very quick example in front of me, and I'll bring you in for the list you've just sent me as well. This is from a forum post on Evolutionary, where a young member had claimed that they wanted to be like our pet pro at the time, Marco Lewis, Monstro, and had seen one of his cycles. In fact, it's not even the worst cycle, but one of the cycles that he'd suggested. And Monstro himself pointed out that I'm a professional bodybuilder, you are not. And I've sent you a message to tell you this is not for you, but I'll read out the cycle. And this again is an example of what Monstro had done at one point. 1,000 milligrams per week of testosterone enanthate, 1,000 milligrams per week of trenbolone, doesn't say which kind, 750 milligrams a week, Steve, of Sustanon 250. That's not actually that bad. 100 milligrams per day of Winstrol reduced to 50 milligrams per day after 4 weeks. And again, the time here is not listed, but I'm going to assume 8 to 12 weeks. And 100 milligrams a day of Anadrol after week 4. In other words, from the 4th week forward. And this wasn't the worst cycle. We've actually done another show where we talked about how he was doing in excess of just different forms of testosterone, different forms of anabolic androgenic steroids. That was, I think, 5,500 milligrams. And again, as big as this was for Monstro, it's not even the worst I've ever seen. So talk about the kind of steroids that top professional bodybuilders would use. And we'll talk about specifically how you can actually buy all of these on Euro Pharmacies.
So Monstro was a hell of a bodybuilder. He was one of our good friends on the forum, and he passed away recently. And one of his cycles, we call it the Monstro cycle. And here's the thing: he wasn't even a Mr. Olympia qualifier, but he did very well.
I'm looking at it now, Steve. Wow.
He did, he did very well for himself. He looked incredible. Yes. He had the body that most of us would kill for, but he was not Mr. Olympia level. But he was a very high level. So this is the cycle. He did 1,250 milligrams of testosterone E. This is a bulking example. Tren Ace, 500 milligrams a week. Anadrol, 100 milligrams a day. T4 and T3, which are thyroid medications. Proviron, 50 milligrams a day, up to 100 milligrams a day. Then he was running Aromacin, which is an AI. Dosinex, which helps with prolactin. And then here's the big one. HGH, 10 IUs post-workout. IGF, which is also a growth peptide, 200 IUs pre-workout. And then insulin, Humalog, 10 IUs pre-workout and 20 IUs post-workout. Lantus, which is also insulin, 30 IUs first meal. And then he was using GHRP, which is another growth peptide, 250 micrograms post-workout before he took the HGH. Wow. And then he was using Telmisartan, 8 milligrams a day. So at the end of the day, he was running a ton of HGH, ton of growth peptides, ton of insulin. He was the key with this bulking stack that he was running, and the reason he was able to put so much muscle on his frames, what I talked about earlier, he's going beyond what the body can put on. And this is going to allow you to build so much muscle and pack so much muscle on your frame. And I think he was only like 5'5" Mobster. I think he was shorter than me, but he was extremely huge and lean. So for him to utilize all that food that he was getting, and he was getting a lot of food day in and day out consistently, lots of protein. For you to
good genetics, Steve. He had great genetics as a teenager, and I gave him a lot of shit for literally the sheer amount of gear that he was using as an example to others. But I've actually said he was a professional bodybuilder. He knew how to promote himself. He worked very well with supplement companies. He worked at events like I've done. He had a 20-foot banner at one event at FIBO, I think, and he would do things like he interviewed Derek Lunsford prior to Derek winning the MrOlympia. He'd literally go up to him. He'd have that kind of personality. He had the physique that promoted him. So yeah, he was a pro. He was
top 0.5% genetics. Notice I said 0.5%. To be Mr. Olympia, you have to have top 0. 1% genetics, not 0.1%, 0.1%.
Yeah.
0.01%.
01. Yeah.
You gotta be of the billions of people in the world, you gotta be top 20 bodybuilding genetics to be Mr. Olympia. Maybe top 100, because maybe there's 80 people out there who don't have the opportunity. They have the genetics, but they don't have the means and the opportunity to even
drive or the interest,
to get there. So I think it's it just shows you how it costs. Now, how do you apply that to, now let's talk about how you can apply these steroids for you. And look, Mobster and I, we've never ran much more than 1 gram of gear a week. I think
No,
Mobster, you've never run even a gram.
just a fraction over a gram.
Yeah,
Yeah.
me too. I think I've the most I've ever, not even a gram. The most I've ever run in my life. I ran 500 milligrams of Sustanon and I ran 400 milligrams of Deca per week. But I also ran an oral. I ran Dianabol to kickstart it.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
that would have
Yeah.
pushed me over a
Similar,
thousand if we're going to be
similar.
technical. So look, at the end of the day, we've never done that. Um, and you listening to this, if you were to run these pro cycles, you would get very, very sick and you would
Mm,
literally give yourself a stroke and have other complications. It's not worth it. So you don't have to run that much gear to reach your goals in this game. So really,
no, no.
my advice is pick one injectable, go to Euro Pharma, check out what they have, pick one of their orals and one of their injectables, and start, if you're new to this, start on the mild end of the spectrum and then work your way up. So Tren, for example, would not be a mild option. So wait to use Tren to your fourth, fifth, sixth, or more
Yeah, yeah,
cycle and
yeah.
have at least a few years of steroid use under your belt. And then that would be my advice with this. So your pharmacies, they have it all. And very, very important that you are using the proper ancillaries. That's another thing that your pharmacies has. They have the
Yes.
AIs you need, they have the PCT products you need, they have everything you need on cycle. And it's very, very important to make sure you do this safely. So at the end of the day, if you do have a dream one day of being Mr. Olympia, maybe one of you listening to this in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years will be Mr. Olympia champion. You can look back at this episode and be like, wow, you know, Mobster and Steve really gave me the motivation to go do it.
Yeah.
If you do have that dream, you still got to start early and see if you even have the genetics. You'll know if you have the genetics when you run your first cycle. You'll
Pretty
know
much. Yep.
the effects that you're getting ahead of time. And
Let me just for a
good.
minute or two, Steve. One of the things you can learn from top professional bodybuilders, and I'm going to keep this point quite short. I've said that when you're looking at a pro cycle for the Mr. Olympia, for example, a very high end competition, you can easily be looking relatively long for most people, and we very rarely advise anybody to do this. But you're looking at around 16 to 20 weeks. You and I would prefer 4 for orals, 4 to 8 for orals, maybe 8 to 12 for injectable type cycles, there or thereabouts. And obviously, I like you to allow time for whatever you're preparing for, whether it's a beach thing, photo shoot, or a bodybuilding competition. But for a top professional bodybuilder, you're probably looking 16 to 20 weeks. But it comes in multiple stages. So what works for a pro should work for you, but with lesser amounts. So, for example, a bulking pro cycle will consist of steroids that help you bulk up. A cutting cycle should include steroids that help you cut down. Now, arguably, you can bulk on cutters and you can cut on bulkers, but that comes to diet, nutrition, cardio, and so on and so forth. But all things being equal, certain steroids are better for bulking with, certain steroids are better for strength, certain steroids are better for cutting. That's kind of simple, an oversimplification, but that's more or less true. And what you will see with top professional bodybuilders is that they're not doing bulking steroids at the end of a competition cycle. They're going to start with bulking steroids. They're going to look tweak the dosages when they get into the middle portion, when they start to see muscle popping, when the body fat starts to drop off as they control the diet and the cardio. And it's more likely to be longer resters at the beginning, shorter resters at the end. It's more likely to be cutting steroids at the end, and so on and so forth. And it's more likely to include other products, peptides, thyroid drugs, etc., etc., but for shorter periods of time. There's also a thing that, well, probably worth saying as I finish this thought, Steve, that not every professional bodybuilder uses grams and grams. Some are, as Steve said, 0.01%. Such fucking freaks that there are amateurs that use more steroids than they do, and these people are still amateurs, whereas this person has such a great response to steroids. And I can think of a couple of examples here. Lee Priest has talked multiple times about the steroids that he's used, and when he gives people the cycles, they wouldn't believe him. He lived with, for a brief period of time, Paul Dillette, and said Paul was doing the same as me, and Paul was an absolute fucking freak, 280 pounds, looked like Frankenstein. And arguably Dorian Yates. Dorian has talked about, and it was multiple PEDs, insulin growth, and 3 or 4 different steroids, and he's talked about his stack, and it would be less than our buddy Monstro used to use. in terms of overall milligrams per week. And yet one was a great WABA Pro, one was the IFBB MrOlympia. So it's how you respond to those things as well. And that's actually important, guys. It's the reason why we wouldn't throw you under the bus with Tren from stack one. But again, the big point here, Steve, and I think Steve will agree with me, is the availability of steroids, including companies like Euro Pharma, is as good as it's ever been. The United Kingdom is pretty much as legal as it's ever going to get, I think. There's only one or two changes to the law that would stop that happening. And you have access to pro-quality steroids in a variety of different steroids with the peptides, with the SARMs, with the growth hormone that you have probably never had at any point in bodybuilding history ever. So you could look at what a pro does, and if you ever get to that level, Euro Pharmacy's got you covered. Talk about some of the steroids, just briefly, Steve, that are available here on Euro Pharmacies. Like you said, Tren is a great example. I'll mention one or two right now. I'm looking at the 15 ml vials again, Steve. Trenbolone acetate, Trenbolone enanthate. The acetate is, I believe, 75 milligrams, Steve, and the enanthate should be 150 milligrams. That's per milliliter for both of those. So just as an example, Steve, talk about what a typical user could use with Tren, and then what we will see pro users using with Tren.
Yeah, so after you build some experience, as I said earlier, and you're ready for your first cycle with Tren, I'd go with Tren Ace because it's in your system a little quicker, but more importantly, it's out of your system quicker once you stop using it. So the side effects on Tren get very brutal. So I would do a 6-week cycle, cap it at 6 weeks. A lot of people say, "Oh, Steve, you don't know what you're talking about. That's too short. You got to run it longer." I don't care if it's too short. You're not going to build a great physique, in one cycle anyway. You're going to keep using steroids. So it's not about building Rome or building Greece in one day, as the cliche goes. It's about, this is a marathon, not a sprint. So cap it at 6 weeks, see how you like it, see how how you handle it. And then the next time, maybe you can go with Tren E and go a little longer, 7 weeks or 8 weeks. So, but that's really all you need. And you can run Tren by itself. We had a thread, someone asking about that, and people are like, "Oh, you got to run tests with it. You got to run tests with it." No, you don't. You don't have to run tests with Tren. Who made that rule? They have to run tests. You know who made that rule? The companies that are trying to sell you tests. That's who made that rule. It's not mandatory to run testosterone with Tren. So you don't have to. You just run Tren by itself. This way, it lowers the side effects. Because now if you add testosterone, now you're dealing with more androgenic side effects and more estrogenic side effects. And a lot of people in the comments are like, "Steve, you don't know what you're talking about, blah, blah, blah." Dude, I know what I'm talking about. All right. Have I ever been wrong on anything? I tell people this all the time. Have I seriously ever been wrong on anything? How many people have come to me over the years?
You're better than I am, Steve, at quoting research and having research to back up.
But I mean, people have come to me over the years and like, "Steve, you know what? I used to think you were wrong on this. Then I listened to your advice, and man, you were right." And I'm like, "Okay, when have I ever been wrong? When have I ever misled someone?" If you want to keep your side effects low, don't include testosterone. If you want more aggression and more appetite and more libido and more all this other stuff, plus all the side effects that come with it, then yes, go ahead and add the testosterone. I'm not saying you shouldn't, but I'm also saying if it's your first time with Tren, you would be better off not including another steroid with it. The more you stack, the more side effects will build up. So that's all I'm saying.
Something I like with Euro Pharmacy, Steve, and funny enough, I'll apply this to pros in the same way I'm going to apply it to myself. And I occasionally get paid for this thing, but I won't say I'm a professional bodybuilder. Is there are certain testosterone derivatives that work for me incredibly well. And I've talked about Sustanon and Deca multiple times. And yet I've also said on other shows that I never seem to get on with testosterone enanthate, yet my buddies absolutely loved it. So one of the things you'll get with top professional bodybuilders, specifically MrOlympia competitors, is that we'll quite often work with a prep coach, mostly because it's a lot easier to have someone else do the thinking. But also what happens there is that the prep coach should have worked with them prior to the competition, worked out what works well for that athlete and what does not. And we don't necessarily need you to experiment by trying every steroid there is, but you should have sufficient, and this is another reason why we wouldn't have you using Tren straight away. You should have sufficient knowledge of how your body responds to certain testosterones or orals or peptides, etc., from your first few cycles, like Steve said, 5-6 cycles. and have a pretty good idea. Oh, my response to Debo was fucking amazing. But my response on Anadrol, And I would the same thing for me, Steve. My response to Anavar, pretty good. My response to Halo testing, negligible. Didn't seem to get anything from it at all. So why would I therefore go and use two drugs that did next to nothing for me versus two other steroids that always worked for me? And the same thing will apply to top professionals, including Mr. Olympias. They have a good idea of what dosages they do well on versus those that made them ill or had no response. They have a good idea of the steroids they do well on versus the steroids they do not. And even silly little things, Steve, which a prep coach would work again. Something you mentioned in the show the other day is understanding that work well for you was in this condition won't necessarily work well for you when you're not in the same condition. And equally, how our bodies change as we age. So what worked for me well when I was younger won't necessarily work for me well when I'm older. And arguably, Steve, the same thing applies to Mr. Olympias. It is that much harder to hold on to muscle tissue, even with steroids, or bring into great condition as you age. And we've seen this with top professionals, including multiple times winners of the Mr. Olympia, where at different times, over 6, 7, 8 wins, whatever it was, for Lee Haney, for Ronnie Coleman, for Phil Heath, for whoever, the physique changed. And it wasn't necessarily experimenting with new drugs or new stacks or new cycles. It's just that their body didn't respond to the training or the nutrition, or literally, Steve, sometimes they got fucking tired of this shit. So again, you need to learn that stuff for you guys. You can't go in and to euphemistically use the biggest hammer in the world, which would be 1,000 milligrams of tren, if it was your very first cycle, because there's an argument to be made, where the fuck do you go from there? You know, I blew up like a balloon, Steve. I was put on 20 pounds of muscle. It's not going to happen the next time. And what are you going to do? 2,000 milligrams of tren, 3,000 milligrams? No. So listen, guys, we could do another show in this quite easily. Check out Euro Pharmacy's products. Look at what professional bodybuilders are using. Choose those products from Euro Pharmacies. Let us know how you get on. Let us know your thoughts on the subject. Do you agree with what we said? Disagree? You got some comments to make on professional cycles? What do you think Mr. Olympias are doing that we don't know about that maybe we could discuss on another show? Please note, we are not doctors and the opinions are ours. Is our view based on our experience and views on the topic. Our podcast for informational purposes and entertainment only. The freedom of speech and the First Amendment applies.